Good afternoon, Silurians. We're pleased today to present a second program on the most important news event in decades, the surprising and surprisingly brutal attack by Russia on the neighboring state of Ukraine, a country that Mr. Putin says never should have existed and which his army is pounding into non-existence. We couldn't have a better speaker to talk to us about the war itself and the larger issues raised by the war than Tim Weiner, former national security and intelligence reporter for The Times and author of many books on the dark art of spying and intelligence. He wrote the definitive story of the American spy Aldrich Ames. He has written histories of both the CIA and FBI. His most recent book, published 2 years ago, is called The Folly and the Glory: America, Russia, and Political Warfare, 1945 to 2020. I picked it up in my local library. You could too. It's really great. It's very beautifully written. Much of the folly he describes is by our side. As he describes it, the CIA, for the first 20 years of its existence, was a mess, sponsoring a series of covert attempts at coups and revolutions that only resulted in hundreds of deaths, many of them of East European emigres seeking to free their nations from the grip of communism. Tim won 2 Pulitzer Prizes even before he joined the Times, one for the Philadelphia Inquirer and another for the Kansas City Times. In an old Times bio I found, he's quoted as saying that his beat for the paper of record was nukes, spooks, and kooks, which has a nice ring to it. Today, Tim continues with his book writing and also has a podcast to which I sent you a link yesterday. It is both commentary and reporting, and the most recent episodes give you insights into the Ukraine war that you won't find elsewhere. Tim will speak to us for a few minutes and then take questions. Tim?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. So what we've been witnessing of the war in Ukraine is nothing less than the resurrection of political warfare by the United States. Political warfare was a term coined by George Kennan. And I have a special pew in the church of my heart roped off for Kennan. With Barbara Crissette, I wrote his obit when he died at the age of 101 back in 2005. Now, what Kennan meant by political warfare was the use of all the powers at a nation's command, short of war, to project its political power and to blunt the projection of its enemies' powers. The tools primarily are everything from diplomacy to economic sanctions, economic warfare, and in particular coercive diplomacy, to intelligence operations, including covert action and support for resistance armies. This was a form of political power that was essentially unknown to the United States at the end of World War II. Kennan, at the close of the war, was the charge d'affaires at the American Embassy in Moscow. And he had spent more time in Russia at that point in his life than in the United States. He was chargé because the actual ambassador, Averell Harriman, wasn't there very much. And in the early months of 1946, Harry Truman and the rest of the newly emerging American national security establishment were completely at a loss to understand Joe Stalin and Stalin's Russia. What did he want? How far was he willing to go? as he pushed westward. Did he really want to start a war? Who were these people anyway? Our erstwhile allies. And a note went out to Kennan at the American Embassy in Moscow. And he said, all right, I'm really going to let him have it. And he let him have it in the form of a 7,000 word dispatch called the Long Telegram, which remains not only the longest, but the most famous diplomatic cable in American history. And what Kennan said in the Long Telegram and in his immediately subsequent writings after he returned to the State Department to take up a new job, a newly created job, Director of Policy Planning under the new Secretary of State, General George C. Marshall, really rings true today. I'm going to give you a few of his lines. The very disrespect of Russians for objective truth, indeed their disbelief in its existence, leads them to view all stated facts as instruments for furtherance of one ulterior purpose or another. He saw the Russian government as a conspiracy within a conspiracy. They operated on the overt level of diplomacy and foreign relations, and on the underground level. And their intelligence apparatus, which is quite well established and well embedded in the United States, in the military-industrial complex, and in the government, was, Kennan said, he's talking about the KGB here, an apparatus of amazing flexibility and versatility managed by people whose experience and skill in underground methods are presumably without parallel in history. He further wrote that Stalin and the Soviet Union might be impervious to the logic of reason, but they were highly sensitive to the logic of force. Upon his return to the United States and his taking up the Directorate of Policy Planning at State, what he did was nothing less than kind of establish the underpinnings of political warfare. The United States at this point did not have a central intelligence agency, nor did it have an understanding of what the Cold War was going to look like. Indeed, the term was not in currency in early 1947. So Kennan not only helped conceive the Marshall Plan. George Marshall didn't really know much about it when he gave the speech that Kennan had helped write to announce it. And not only did he help create NATO, but he also was the intellectual author of the creation of the clandestine service of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the fiercest proponent of these covert operations to contain the Soviets and indeed to roll them back out of Central Europe. Kennan disavowed most of this later in his life. He was against NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War, and he never acknowledged the fact that he was the father of covert operations at the CIA. He denied paternity, although the DNA tests of documents declassified after the Cold War proved it. So the United States eventually got fairly good at political warfare. It set up powerful instruments. Radio Free Europe was owned and operated by the CIA from its inception until the mid-70s. And that was a stunning example of how you could use information as a weapon of the Cold War. It conducted political warfare operations of some skill. An example would be underground support for Solidarity in Poland after the imposition of martial law there in 1981. Anybody here remember Michael Kaufman? Michael was in Warsaw in 1985, and he saw, although he didn't really understand what he was seeing in that this was a technology that the CIA had smuggled in the hands of Solidarity. He was at the apartment of a above ground Solidarity activist, and the 7 o'clock news came on, and it was a gray man in a gray suit reading the latest bulletins about tractor production, meeting the 5-year plan on coal. And about 10 minutes into the broadcast of the state-run 7 o'clock news, a banner appeared on the television screen that said, "Solidarity lives," and advised listeners to tune in at a certain frequency to hear underground Solidarity radio. That was technology supplied by CIA, and it was, in fact, part of a much not a big covert operation, but a substantial one, where they began to supply Solidarity with paper, pens, ink, printing presses, fax machines, Xerox machines, and then later these underground clandestine radio and television technologies. In other words, the tools of a free press. Solidarity lived. Solidarity took power through free and fair elections, and that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire in the 20th century. Now, unfortunately, the last political warfare operation that the United States conducted, insofar as political warfare requires harmonizing the powers of intelligence, diplomacy, and often economic warfare, was in 2000, when CIA, in a modest operation, supported State Department above ground initiative to help defeat Slobodan Milosevic at the polls in Serbia. After 9/11, with the advent of the war on terror, this was abandoned. Bush, W. Bush, went on a crusade in which he believed democracy could be established at gunpoint, and he was wrong about that. For the ensuing 20 years, up until the fall of Kabul back last summer, the full force and attention of American intelligence was focused on counterterrorism operation. Not support for democracy, but more of a kill them all, let God sort them out mindset. And, Obama was no less guilty of this than George W. Bush. And certainly Trump had no interest in support for democracy or anything other than using lethality as a weapon of American intelligence. Lest we forget, in the 20th century, the CIA conducted very, very few lethal operations. Its attempted assassination plots against Fidel Castro and others were just that, attempted assassination plots. Contrary to popular culture, CIA officers do not go around killing people, or did not, until the advent of the war on terror. So last summer, after the fall of Kabul, the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Bill Burns. Anyone out there ever run into Bill Burns on assignment or elsewhere? Burns was the American ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2006. Speaks fluent Russian. 2008, excuse me. So in the first, Putin era, speaks fluent Russian as well as fluent Arabic. Is one of the great foreign service officers of his generation. So Burns kind of surveyed the landscape after Kabul fell and decided it was time for the re-inauguration of political warfare, as Kennan had first defined it back 75 years before. The CIA refocused its attention away from a single-minded devotion to counterterrorism operations and toward the great power struggles of yore, which hadn't gone away with Russia and with China. And starting, I'm going to say maybe September, October, certainly no later than October, CIA picked up strong indications that Putin was going to try and crush Ukraine. Burns actually went over to talk to Putin in early November and say essentially, we know what you're planning and we strongly suggest that you not do that. And Putin predictably told him to buzz off. In January, these warning signs that Putin was actually going to do what he has subsequently done became overwhelming. And Burns, remarkably, decided that it would be an extremely good idea to declassify and make public what the CIA knew, not just about Putin's military intentions to wipe Ukraine off the face of the earth, but the pretexts that Putin planned to use in the run-up to the war, including a blitzkrieg of disinformation, staging a false flag attack, creating videos with corpses and actors purporting to represent a Ukrainian chemical weapons attack, propaganda videos proclaiming, that the Ukrainians were Nazis. And the thing is, he had done exactly this 8 years before in the run-up to the seizure of Crimea and the Eastern Donbass, a blitzkrieg of propaganda. The Ukrainians are Nazis. They're crucifying children in the town square. They're poisoning the wells. They're setting up concentration camps, and the U.S. and NATO are behind it. He did this in 2014, and the U.S. and NATO had no response whatsoever to that. The American intelligence community watched that like a cow watching a train go by. I mean, they saw it, but they didn't understand. This time, they were prepared. So on 17 February, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, made a speech in the United Nations, warning the world, A, that the invasion was going to happen, and B, that Putin was going to use these propaganda and disinformation pretexts to justify the war. That had two effects. One, it convinced the disbelieving world that the invasion was indeed going to happen. And two, it totally neutralized Putin's disinformation weapons and removed the pretext that he was planning to use to start the war. What we've since seen is a pretty amazing, first of all, that proclamation, and it hasn't stopped in the ensuing 2 months. It was kind of like 10 Adlai Stevensons with 10 U-2 photographs of Soviet missiles in Cuba. It was an order of magnitude beyond anything the United States had done in the declassification of secret intelligence as a weapon of political warfare. And two, it has emboldened not only the United States, but indeed most of NATO to become undeclared combatants in this war. It's a remarkable development, not just for American intelligence, but in the continuing impact it's had on the events unfolding before us. Most geopolitical events are like geotectonic events. They happen imperceptibly. This is an earthquake, and it will have a greater and longer lasting impact on the 21st century than I think the 9/11 attacks. We are now in a global war of democracies against autocracies, and political warfare is a crucial weapon in that conflict. And with that, I will shut up and listen.
You have, over the years, been a harsh critic of the CIA and the American intelligence community, and you just were again. However, their light shined bright in this instance. They had the intelligence that this invasion was going to happen weeks before it actually did, which is a feather in their cap. Do they have assets in the Kremlin?
When you say assets, there's more than one way to skin that cat. Certainly, they stole Putin's war plans. Now, whether they did that with electronic intercepts or with spies or informants, I suspect they have both. Putin's inner circle right now is extremely small. He speaks to very few people. He's in a closed feedback loop of information, but I strongly suspect that the theft of his war plans, including his disinformation operations, came from both bugs and taps and moles, all three.
We continue to get some fairly solid information, on what's going on behind the scenes. The purges of FSB people and other high officials. What do we know about that?
The FSB is kind of the internal service, and the SVR is the external service. But the FSB has a component, the Fifth Directorate, which was responsible for spying on the former, well, we used to call it the satellite states, the former Soviet republics outside of Russia. And I know with interest that the general, the intelligence general, Sergei Beseda, who was responsible for Ukraine, is reportedly under house arrest, and he's probably in the Leforto, the old KGB prison in downtown Moscow. This is good. We want to see more ferment, fear, and trembling in the ranks of the Russian intelligence services.
I'm going to read from your book a little bit here about Donald Trump. As an autocrat, after his acquittal in the Senate, affirmed that he could lie and cheat to stay in power. In Trump's vision of America, all power resided in the president. Congress could not control him. Courts could not judge him. Laws could not constrain him. He worked through his attorney general to erase the evidence of the Kremlin's political warfare, thus, quote, abetting a Russian covert operation to keep him in office for Moscow's interest, not America's. The fawning and bootlicking of his allies and aides and right-wing media acolytes resembled the high councils of North Korea, where everyone has to admire the before leader. He purged the leadership of the American intelligence and national security agencies, replacing them with dishonest and disreputable partisans. He cut off the flow of intelligence reporting to Congress and the American people, increasing the risk of dangerous miscalculation and disastrous surprise. Whew. How much damage did Trump do, and how far has the Biden administration gone to repair it?
When I talk about a battle between democracy and autocracy, that's happening right here at home. The war is all around us, and dear friends and colleagues, you are a part of it, whether you like it or not. Autocratic impulses of Donald Trump, not excluding his deep devotion to Vladimir Putin, his parroting of Putin's talking points, his kowtowing and bootlicking towards Putin throughout his term in office. None of that has gone away. On the most popular cable television news show in America, Tucker Carlson is nightly parroting Putin's talking points which are then replayed on Russian state-controlled media. This is a global battle. Ukraine is taking the pointed end of the spear right now, but this is ultimately a battle for the truth, and our democracy is in danger because of the constant application of lies and its effect on the American body politic by Trump and his supporters.
And in Russia, as I said in a note to you, we have a Talibanish crackdown on the press, pretty much, well, maybe you'll disagree, an elimination of the independent free press.
We're having a Stalinist crackdown
sure.
on the free press, which has almost been eliminated in Russia. And one of the interesting things that's happening is, I will bet you $1 to a donut that CIA is helping create technological workarounds, including VPNs and other internet technologies, to see if America and its allies can't get truthful information about the war to the Russian people. To pierce Putin's Iron Curtain in the way that Radio Free Europe did in the Soviet era.
Is it possible for a Russian to access the New York Times?
Yeah, if they have VPN workarounds, sure. Virtual private networks. It's a doodad that lets you get into the internet or around blockades. VPNs are of the 10 top downloaded apps in Russia today, 8 are VPNs.
Jim, 2 questions. One, do you think the United States had any role in helping the Ukrainians sink the warship by jamming the electronic defenses the ship presumably had? And 2, where do you see the cyber war going with the Biden administration constantly warning that Russia's going to launch a cyber attack on banks, et cetera?
Well, let me take the second question first, because I really don't know the answer to the first question. The Ukrainians have been mighty nimble with the military technology they have, and hopefully they'll be getting a lot more, because the only way this war is going to come to a successful conclusion is I hate to sound bloody-minded, but is sending Russians home in body bags. The capabilities for cyber warfare are enormous on both sides. Putin, if he wanted to, could within an hour take down the electric grid of major American cities. And we could do the same to him. The problem is that nobody has worked out a doctrine of escalation in cyber warfare in the excruciatingly detailed way that Henry Kissinger and Herman Kahn and the rest of the high priests of thermonuclear warfare did in the 50s and the 60s. It's not quite like, they take Miami and we take Vladivostok. It's a lot more complicated than that because of the interconnectivity of the modern world. This war could escalate in a dozen different unpredictable ways to include NATO and the United States, and cyber would be high on the list of those ways.
Tim, thanks for a terrific talk, in the course of which you said, I think, that Putin has in mind to wipe Ukraine off the face of the earth, or some phrase like that. It's a very large phrase, and it involves a great deal. And I frankly am not sure what it's based on.
Let me rephrase that then, Marvin. to wipe Ukraine off the map.
Okay, how do you
To
wipe
literally wipe it off the map by making Ukraine cease to exist as a nation state. First by destroying its army, and then by reincorporating Ukraine into Russia. Putin believes it was a gigantic historical mistake for Khrushchev to essentially restore the nation of Ukraine back in, I believe it was 54. Am I right?
Right.
And he would like to reverse that titanic historical error.
Khrushchev was Ukrainian, I would remind the audience.
Yeah, well, Stalin was a Georgian, and it didn't increase his love for Georgia.
I'm trying to figure out if we do go back into the history aspect and assume that Putin has read it, and in many cases he has misread it, and that is obvious. Does it make sense for him, from the point of view of long-term Russian interest, to wipe out Ukraine as a functioning, operating state? I can understand him trying to install a very friendly government. I can understand him trying to, quote, demilitarize. He plays around with phrases like denazify, which is sort of silly. On the other hand, there were, and probably still are, pro-Nazi groups within Ukraine that have functioned there actively, and we have supported actively since World War II. Does it make sense for Putin to do what you said, as opposed to something short of that, that I consider to be more in long-term Russian interest?
Well, first of all, Marvin, I would push back on the idea that large or significant segments of the Ukrainian body politic are Nazis. I mean, we have neo-Nazis in the United States, right? But the idea that, I mean, I think that the Nazi or Nazi sympathizing forces in Ukraine died with Stephen Bandera when the KGB killed him in Germany 50 years ago. Those were Nazis, and while there may be neo-Nazis in Ukraine, the idea that Putin can legitimately justify the use of force in Ukraine by calling the Ukrainians Nazis is abhorrent. Again, to quote George Kennan, he said that some in the Soviet Union might be, quote, impervious to the logic of reason, but they were, quote, highly sensitive to the logic of force. Nobody that I'm aware of in this universe understands what Vladimir Putin is thinking except Vladimir Putin. Absent his, pouring out his heart and soul, or, being kidnapped and injected with sodium pentothal, we can only assume that he means what he does, he means what he says, and he's doing what he intends, which is to destroy Ukraine cities as he destroyed, Syrian cities, as he destroyed Grozny, and to eliminate, by eliminating the cities, by eliminating the people, and by eliminating the Ukraine's armed forces, to erase Ukraine as an independent nation from the earth. Now, we can quibble about whether this is genocide, but we cannot, I think, quibble about whether this constitutes the greatest war crimes in Europe since 1945, and I include Srebrenica.
There's sentiment in Europe in the past few days that there's a crossroads coming up with the G20 meeting and the combat situation, that Donbass should be given up and there should be a population exchange like in Greece and Turkey, both both sides of the political spectrum. So what is the U.S. fixated on? Total victory, which is what? Regime change, or is it still in favor of negotiation? Because there's a lot of people, especially in Germany and Italy, who are talking about this.
I wish I could give you a coherent answer to that. I think that we are seeing a few hairline cracks in the unity of NATO in its response to the Russians. I think the Germans are about to have a come to Jesus moment on an eventual embargo on Russian energy. Viktor Orban in Hungary presents a problem, but I think that the arms supply chain to Ukraine is dramatic, has the capacity to blunt the Russian offensive, and in time to defeat the Russians militarily. If that happens, and I'm saying the arms supply and the intelligence supply to back up the use of the arms can make a huge difference. If the Russian military offensive is blunted, the Russian and say they claim, okay, we're partitioning Ukraine and we're keeping the eastern half. What are you going to do about it? The Russians will then face an insurgency that will make Afghanistan look like a cocktail reception. And I think it is possible that they will be militarily defeated, and that will be the end of Putin's regime.
How possible?
He who lives by the crystal ball will wind up eating broken glass, but it's possible.
This Ukraine business has made us all forget about Afghanistan and our failures there.
I did 7 tours there. Afghanistan is a country near and dear to my heart.
And what were the failures? The intelligence failures, particularly. Why didn't we know that the Afghan army would lay down its arms and surrender?
I was in Afghanistan in early 2002 when the Bush administration said, "Okay, we won. The Taliban have been defeated," and then pivoted 180 degrees toward Iraq in preparation to destroy Saddam Hussein's regime. The Taliban weren't defeated. They trimmed their beards and melted into the mountains to live and fight another day. I mean, anyone who had ever read a book about Afghanistan, much less set foot in the place, would know that Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, the British 3 times, and the Soviets once got their asses kicked by the Afghans, who do not like foreign infidels occupying their country. The first British expeditionary force went in there in 1839 with 16,000 strong. One came out. The American effort in Afghanistan was an attempt to create an ally with cash. Giant, bulging suitcases full of shrink-wrapped $100 bills, essentially to bribe people into loyalty and to kill them if they wouldn't take the bribes. It was doomed, not from day one, but from about day 100. If I were an army captain or even an army general in Afghanistan, I'd go sit down with the village khan, the head man, and drink a lot of tea and say, "So are there any bad guys around here?" And the village khan would say, "Yeah, that motherfucker in the next valley, he's a really bad guy." and I would give him a suitcase full of cash and say thanks a lot and go kill the guy in the next valley. This is, the two guys on the other side, both sides of the mountain, had a beef going back to the 14th century. That's not a way to run a war, and that's not intelligence. And that's how the United States military conducted itself in Afghanistan. I don't know. I was so angry when that war ended and how the war ended that for the first time in my life I couldn't write about it. There is a special circle in hell reserved for Donald Rumsfeld, who represents the arrogance of American imperial power better than anyone I can think of in the history of this country. Rumsfeld had a contempt for intelligence. He had a contempt for his superiors and his inferiors, and he lived in a world of his own. He was one of the most destructive people in American public life, going back to the Nixon administration, which is saying something, right, Alan?
And how did the intelligence community feel about him?
The problem was that as Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld controlled 90% of the American intelligence budget. And that was the case until the so-called reformations of 2005 and 6. So, he's the 800-pound gorilla in the American intelligence community as it was constituted until 0506. And Rumsfeld hated it that the CIA was the first in Afghanistan. And that war could have been, I don't know, won, but it would not have been a disaster if it remained an intelligence war. But it became a gigantic military American expedition, and that is what doomed it. Every army of liberation has a half-life of about 6 months until it becomes an army of occupation.
Let me ask, unless you assume that Putin is just divorced from reality, he, to some degree, we assume, has thought through what happens next. Whether if he assumes that he can win in Ukraine, and he sees what has happened to Soviet standing and Soviet trade and resurrection of NATO, whatever, all of it, aren't we really on the cusp of something that we are not facing? There will be a expanded conflict. Maybe the first choice would be politically, if you get someone like Le Pen in France and Trump-like or Trump again into the United States. And failing that, a more serious conflict. Regarding this thought of a guerrilla warfare in Ukraine, there is a little difference that Russia is on the border of Ukraine. And it's a little different scenario than the last few guerrilla wars that we are familiar with supply lines and so on and so forth, and indigenous helpers on the ground and whatever.
I would remind you that the Soviet Union was on the border of Afghanistan.
Yes, that's true. But not in the same way, not Slavic in the same way. Do you foresee that this thing can end in, other than a regime change in Russia, aren't we really on the cusp of a more serious conflict? And are we doing enough to plan for it and get ready for it?
I do not think the United States is in the business of regime change in Russia. And I think that the assumption that Putin is playing 9-dimensional chess on the global battlefield is probably wrong. He is an aging despot who has announced his intention to remain in power for the next 14 years. He will certainly, through his intelligence services, do everything he can to help Donald Trump get reelected, as he did in 2016. And he will do everything, as he's done, to try and elect puppets or agents of influence in France. He's done it in Hungary. He's done it in most of the former Soviet satellite states to rearrange the chessboard in his favor. But there is, is there a red line of what the US and NATO are doing to supply Ukraine that would cause him to escalate to nuclear or chemical weapons or, attack Poland or Germany? I don't think so. I think he's got his hands full here. He, according to American intelligence, assumed that he could take Kyiv in 72 hours. He is back on his heels. He is, by all accounts, arresting some of his intelligence people and his military people, sacking people. He's lost 8 generals in combat in 8 weeks, indicating the disarray of Russian military strategy and logistics. You normally don't have generals out there running tank brigades. And I think the best assessment is the United States and the West have to keep trying to arm Ukraine to the teeth so that thousands more Russians go home in body bags and the Russian people begin to realize that they're in a grueling, grinding war in which their sons are being slaughtered. We really can't appreciate the extent to which the Russian people have been brainwashed by years and years of propaganda and by the pervasiveness of state television. I mean, aside from an intellectual elite, many of whom have fled Russia, the great majority of the Russian people exist on, government salaries and pensions and get their news from the incredible machine that is Russian state media, which has been blasting them with this, the Ukrainians are Nazis, and this is the glorious war of World War II. This is the final battle of World War II. We need to break through. We, the collective West, need to get information to the Russian people and need to defend Ukraine with lethal weapons. I mean, this really is a battle of democracy versus autocracy. Lou Simons writes a question: did NATO expansion give Putin a legitimate beef? NATO expansion, which George Kennan opposed, by the way, Lou, Putin is furious about it. But NATO expansion was not, NATO expanded because countries wanted to join it. Because initially, Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, and then laterally other countries wanted to join it because they had memories of Russian imperialism in living memory. Now, when George W. Bush said in 2007, yeah, and we want Georgia and Ukraine too, that was probably a strategic blunder because Putin leapt on that. And, within months, he had launched an incredible cyber attack on Estonia. He partitioned Georgia militarily in 2008. and he began planning for his military assault on Ukraine. So the initial NATO expansion, you can argue it both ways, but NATO didn't like press gang Poland into joining. Poland wanted to join NATO because of Russia. NATO was also not an effective military alliance, really, in Europe until about 6 weeks ago. So NATO expansion, again, you can argue it both ways. Many people have argued it both ways, but the initial embrace of former Soviet republics was a mutual embrace. And the other thing is, to join NATO, you had to be a democracy. And Ukraine wasn't one in 2008, nor was Georgia.
Catherine Harris asks if it's all about getting control of Ukraine's commodities.
Ukraine, has been the breadbasket of Europe for centuries. No, I don't think that it's about Putin wanting to corner, the black bread market. This is imperial war, Putin Putin's not like a big fan of Joseph Stalin, although he has rehabilitated him to a great extent. He is a fan of the czars, and he wants nothing less to reconstitute imperial Russia in Central Europe. That is his war aim. If he takes Ukraine, he will not stop there. If you are a despot who has been in power for 22 years and has seen that you can project your power through the brutal extermination of people you consider subhuman, as he did in Chechnya, as he did in Syria, and no one stops you, then you would consider it logical to keep on doing that if you wanted to perpetuate your power until your death. And that's about as psychological as I can get with Vladimir Putin.
I say megalomania is sort of psychiatric.
Now Lou Simons, as is his wont, asks a very good question, which is, what effect would a GOP takeover of Congress in November have on the war in Ukraine and indeed on Russia? It is a curious fact that the first impeachment of Donald Trump centered on Trump extorting Zelensky by denying him delivery of $400 million worth of equipment, including the Javelin missiles they're using to destroy Russian tanks right now, in exchange for a delivery of non-existent dirt on Joe Biden. That's what Trump was impeached for. And at the impeachment hearings, a great number of Republican congressmen, including some committee chairmen, kept mouthing Russian propaganda that Ukraine was somehow behind the 2016 election monkey wrench. And you may remember Fiona Hill in the impeachment hearings telling those Republican congressmen, what you are doing is perpetuating Russian disinformation and you ought to stop it. Russian disinformation has become a hallmark of GOP talking points. And it's not just geopolitical either. This obsession with pedophilia is a Putin obsession. He's been harping on pedophiles and the moral corruption of homosexuals for years. And now what used to be a minority wing of the Republican Party, the QAnon wing, has picked this up. And you saw it at the confirmation hearings for Justice Jackson. The extent to which Russian disinformation has penetrated the American politic is profound and not fully understood. And it will be a central plank of the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which is the majority wing at this point in the November elections. It's not just political disinformation, it is cultural warfare.
Do you think Hawley and Cruz, realized that they were parroting a Russian line?
I don't know about Hawley and Cruz, but I could, name you a dozen prominent Republican members of Congress who parrot Russian disinformation regularly and have done so for years. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin is prominent among them. The idea that the Ukrainians are Nazis and that Zelensky's a thug has become a major Republican talking point, and not just on the Marjorie Taylor Greene, Madison Cawthorn, wing. The extent to which Russian political warfare in the form of disinformation has penetrated the American body politic is reflected in 100 different facets. And there is a closed feedback loop between Tucker Carlson and his ilk on Fox News, Russian state media, and the American people.
But is it Rupert Murdoch the key entry point?
Anybody here ever met Rupert Murdoch? I mean, does he care that his people are poisoning the American body politic? I mean, not if the ratings are good.
Is RT still in the air? I'm not sure whether it is.
RT is pretty hard to pick up on cable right now, but Tucker Carlson is doing a pretty good job. A week or two ago was talking about, secret Pentagon-backed Ukrainian biolabs creating biological weapons against the Russian people. This is cloud cuckoo land bullshit that starts in Russia, is repeated on Fox News, and becomes part of the American political discourse.
Tim, do you think that Putin will be desperate enough to use nuclear or chemical weapons?
There is a taboo on the use of these weapons. It is conceivable, I think. I mean, there are so-called suitcase nukes that you can fit in a briefcase that have a yield of, 1/100th of the Hiroshima bomb. It is conceivable that he would use those clandestinely and deny them. But if you're talking about, tactical nuclear weapons launched from Russia to level cities, city-busting nukes, I find it hard to get my mind around that. He had planned to use chemical weapons in a false flag attack and blame it on the Ukrainians. The American political warfare offensive 2 months ago took that off the table. Would he do it again? Conceivable.
He's had good success at destroying Ukrainian cities with conventional arms. So it doesn't look like he would need a nuke.
As someone, as we all did, we all grew up with the shadow of nuclear warfare hanging over us. I think nuclear weapons still exist simply to deter their use by your enemy. And I'm not sure anybody's shifted off that system of belief yet.
What should Biden do that he hasn't done?
I think that he should encourage the recalcitrant NATO nations like Germany to step up their game, to ratchet up the economic sanctions, to keep the weapons flowing. But I think ultimately, we've seen economic sanctions come and go. These, if you put an energy embargo on Russian oil, their economy will crater. And if you destroy a currency, you can destroy a regime. And if Biden could somehow stiffen the spine of the leaderships of primarily Germany, that would have a salutary effect on the course of this war. Everybody happy? Everybody cheery? Isn't this? Did you imagine this? Was going to be what the face of the earth was going to look like this year?
Springtime for Putin. Tim Weiner, thank you so much for spending so much time with us.
Great to see you guys. And God bless you all.
Thank you very much.